Today is Pivoting to Online Teaching. This is kind of a slightly updated version of a workshop I offered for the very first time back in May for all our folks who were planning to adjust their summer courses here at the Institute for dealing with online. And now we're basically kind of talking about some of the same things for fall. This is kind of part one of a sequence of workshops that we've got. And I suspect some of you have signed up for some of our other workshops. We have other kind of follow-ups to this on active learning, one specifically on setting up what's called a weekly overview. And then we have kind of a working session, question and answer session available to you as well. So think of this as like the introduction to things, and then perhaps you'll build off of some of the stuff we talk about today in those other sessions. And of course, as Joyce and I are always available for one-on-one help if that's something that you would prefer for whatever you're dealing with. So here is my agenda for today, which is a lot to do in an hour, but hopefully this is a kind of a good place to get you started in terms of thinking about what you're going to be doing for the fall. I always like to remind people that, like, this is challenging, but there is a lot we can learn from how people have done online teaching and learning in the past, what some of the people who have already dealt with this kind of unplanned switch to remote learning in the spring, and slightly planned in the summer, and hopefully a little bit more planned for the fall. There are people that have kind of come before us and figured out some things that are new and different in this challenge. So we'll talk about that. But this is my my plan for today. So where do you even start? This was a question I got a lot back in May, and have started to get again in July and August as people are getting ready for fall, especially because, I'm not necessarily assuming, or I'm kind of assuming that most of the folks here today did not have to teach online this summer. Show of hands, who is teaching in the fall kind of online for the first time? Many hands. Okay, looks like most hands. So that's more or less what I expected. So that's good. And hands and a thumbs up. So my assumption is that you don't have the experience of having to deal with this summer, and that's why you showed up for a workshop. So that's good. We're all on the same page. So people ask me, where do I even start? And instructional designers, like, we're required by law to mention goals and course objectives like once a day, or we get in trouble. So to me, it's all about your goals, and goals and course objectives mean slightly different things. Sometimes people use them interchangeably, which causes instructional designers to flinch a little bit, but don't worry about that. You always want to think about, what are your goals for your course? What does your course need to accomplish? Some of these may be like the things you have in your head in terms of like this is where students need to be. This is the next course in the sequence I'm preparing them for. This is the experience in the clinic that I want them to be ready for. This is the thing I know from my experience as a clinician that I want them to be ready for. And some of that may be things that are kind of codified in writing. So for example, to my knowledge, all syllabi at the Institute have a set of course objectives that they had to define in order to get approved. And those are basically the places where we say, this is where students need to be, and we expect them to be by the end of the course. And as an instructional designer, I want you to think about those. Those are a lot more important than how you may have taught a course in the past. And I know some of you you've had a course that you now have to redevelop for online. Some of you have taken over a course that's new to you, so you're in a little bit different of an equation in terms of you're developing your own course for the first time, but weren't planning to be online. There's lots of different permutations on that. But I would suggest that it's really important for thinking about teaching remotely. Do not necessarily worry about how did I do with that course in the past, so much as what are the goals that I now need to meet, and I may need to meet that in different ways. Because if you're just trying to like take a course that used to be in the classroom and like, I don't know, squish it into an online box, it's not necessarily going to fit. The important thing is not what did the course look like, but how did you meet those goals in the past, and how are you going to meet the goals in the future? If you're developing a course that's like new to you, that's great. In some ways, you have less baggage than folks who may have taught a course for a long time in the classroom and are now trying to adapt that online. But always go back to, what are your goals? What are the course objectives? Related to that, this is a question I frequently ask people. Some people may have done, we have a multi-day workshop we've offered in the past. We aren't doing it this summer. We're doing these little workshops instead, but we have this workshop called the Course Design Institute. And one of the things I ask faculty very early on in that multi-day workshop is, what is the most important concept or idea in your course. And we're going to do this as a little activity. I want you to think about this question and type an answer into the Zoom chat. So that means we'll all be able to see it. And, you know, sometimes I give people an intentionally like a very small like piece of paper or a Post-it note or an index card, because some people can write a lot. And the goal here is not to write a lot. The goal here is to really think about like, what's the most important thing? We sometimes call this like a big rock, in that like, this might be the kind of immovable thing that all your other core aspects of your teaching have to kind of like work around. So I'm kind of vamping as I wait for some things to show up in the chat. I am managing a lot of windows here on my little computer, but I have the chat window and the participant window and my PowerPoint open. So if you haven't used Zoom recently, there should be a little button for chat along the bottom. It's got, and that's a place where you can put in messages, and anyone who's logged into the Zoom can see it. And I just want you to, I want to see your answers to the question, what is the most important concept or idea in your course that you're thinking about for the fall? What's the one thing, if students learn nothing else, they'll learn this? Okay, so things are starting to flow in here. Students need to consider how HL impacts hearing loss, I think from context, impacts on the client's communication. That is a great big rock. The formation of organ systems, that seems like a big rock. Professional reasoning and how to use it, develop it for professional practice. Competent and ready for level 2 pediatric. Enough understanding of normal and disordered vocal anatomy and function to understand treatment concepts to address disordered functions. These are good. These are all learned functional applications, cognitive rehab therapy across settings. These are good. These are all big rocks when I see these, in terms of like, they're very like, this covers a lot, right? It's not like this is something you probably like, check mark, we did that in 1 hour, we're good to go on to the next things. These are things that like probably the whole course, if not most of the course, is going to be focused on covering. So the reason I asked you to think about these is your answer to this question like needs to kind of be the anchor that all your other decisions about what your online course for the fall is going to look like. You can't compromise the stuff that you just put in here for what's the most important stuff. Other stuff can kind of shift and be adjusted, but your course needs to accomplish this thing, or you're not going to feel great about it. Your students may not feel great about it. Your students may not be prepared for what they need to do next, etc. But I think these are good in terms of thinking about big rocks. Some people phrase these kind of very formally in a goal or objective language, where it's like they need to be able to do this in that context. Others are more informal, but I think you all got the idea of big, broad, big picture things that students need to do in the course, and that many aspects of the course are going to fit into. All right, so you've got your big rock in mind. And sometimes I even ask people like, write your big rock down on like a sticky note and have it like next to your computer and think about that, because that's the thing that you want to be thinking about as you start planning your course. So the next up, we got to think about, we're dealing with this new remote online world. Technology is going to be the thing that's going to be important to us. We have to think about what technology resources will you employ. And there's a list of these in the handout, in the worksheet I sent people, that also includes links to all of the IT group at IHP, their documentation on all of these things. But you've got on your left some of your kind of basic features in D2L, and depending on how new you are to the Institute, some of you may be familiar with all of these, and some of you may be brand new to these. D2L, for anyone who's newish, D2L is our online, they call it a learning management system, but it's basically a online website that students have access to, that you have a variety of ways to post materials and activities for students. So many people have used some of the basic features of D2L as part of any class, but now that you're doing more and more online, you are going to be using more tools and perhaps graduating from some of the basic and intermediate to using more intermediate and advanced things. So I think a lot of people start with using D2L as like, this is a place where I post content. The next level is like, okay, I want to manage grades in D2L and collect student works. And then perhaps the most advanced is like, okay, lots of activities are happening in D2L. I'm going to do weekly discussion areas. I'm going to have quizzes that grade themselves in D2L and so on. But D2L has a lot of tools, some of which are listed there to help you manage some of those. I've got some other tools listed on the right side of the screen here, which I suspect you are less likely to be familiar with, but some of you may know about some or all of these. D2L Capture is a tool that we have for doing recordings. There's kind of two flavors of D2L Capture. There's only one that you care about right now. There used to be, we still have it, it's just not in use very much, is a way that you could record your classroom sessions to post for students. Not happening right now, but people would schedule, like, I need my classroom recorded at this time window, and there's a camera in the ceiling that would record it depending on which classroom you're in. There is also a version of D2L Capture that is a program you can install on your computer that a lot of people use for doing recordings of lecture style content. So if, for example, you want to do a recording of some kind of lecture that you might have given in the past, you could have PowerPoint open and you could have this D2L Capture program running, and you could record a short video of you in a little window and your PowerPoint slide on the other side of the screen, and produce a video that you could share with students of lecture style content. And I think that has kind of gone from something that relatively few folks at the IHP were using before April to many people are using now. Respondus Lockdown Browser is a tool that some people use for locking down what a student can do on their computer when you're giving them an exam. There are some kind of add-on features that people do for security with doing online exams. That's a big topic that I don't think we'll get too much into today. Zoom is a thing that, used to be some people knew about, and now we all live in Zoom. So I don't know how much experience various people have with Zoom, but you probably been using it for meetings. Many people are using it for basically the online version of their meetings for their course sessions. It's worth knowing there's kind of two ways you can use Zoom. There's the kind of default way you might set up a meeting in Zoom. There's also a Zoom add-on in D2L, which can be a convenient place for students to see where they get the link to your Zoom sessions. So if you schedule Zoom sessions through D2L, there's a Zoom button in D2L, it makes it really easy for students to see, like, oh, here's the link. And so some of you may have experienced, for example, this summer, like a lot of people scheduling meetings in Zoom, a lot of emails flying back and forth with different Zoom links in them that you have to hunt down. If you're using this for student meetings, scheduling them in D2L is kind of a nice way to make those kind of conveniently available to students. Zoom gets used in a lot of different ways. It's obviously the kind of powerful synchronous tool. When we first started dealing with this rapid switch to online teaching, there were a lot of people that it was like, well, I had my 3-hour classroom class that met on Fridays for 3 hours, and now it's going to meet in Zoom for 3 hours, and that's just what people did. That did not always work very well. And there's been a lot of kind of writing and work on why that doesn't work very well and how to think about that. And that's something I'll talk more about shortly. There are also people using more and more various media tools to communicate with students or have students communicate with each other. Flipgrid, which I mentioned there, is a Microsoft product that we have access to, is one. There's also another one built into D2L I should put on the slide called Video Note, but more and more people are doing things where they want students to say, record a short video of themselves doing something, talking about something, explaining something, and share that with each other. And it used to be that, the kind of tools for doing that were kind of cumbersome and clunky. And now we've got a couple tools that are like built into D2L, or in the case of Flipgrid, an add-on to D2L that make it really easy for students to do relatively quickly produce video content to share with each other. That's been a big deal in programs in the spring and summer where students really need to be like practicing something and showing it to other students or to an instructor to document what they're doing, and that a text-based discussion is just not going to cover. So those are just kind of, I know that's a lot, but that is a big range of things that you might think about using this fall in your courses. Any questions about things? People can feel free to put questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, whatever is your preference, feel free to stop me at this. This is, let's stop now and see if there's any questions about this so far. Nope, people are okay.
Tony, have you had feedback from faculty this summer, the pros and cons of D2L Capture versus Zoom recording for 4 slides ahead of time for asynchronous?
For asynchronous, I think D2L Capture streamlines it versus there's more work to do in Zoom. I think a lot of people now so you can go in and create a Zoom meeting for yourself as a one person and record it and then go and download it and bring it into D2L. I think just the D2L capture is a little bit, it's like less people know about it because everyone knows about Zoom now, but it has less clicking, right? Because D2L capture like wants to take your file and stick it right in D2L for you. So I think you can kind of get to either place from with either tool. I think D2L capture is probably a little bit more streamlined. So
Great, thank you.
cool, good question. Anyone else? Questions, thoughts? Okay, let's head onward. So these are relevant technologies. Here I've got kind of a table. And this was actually the earliest version of this started life as a document that we had put together several years ago for Snowmageddon when people were thinking about like, I need to move a class session online. And now it's, I need to move an entire class online. So just kind of a grid for you here on the left, common teaching and learning activities, and on the right, what technology you might use to accomplish that. And again, different people may have different levels of familiarity with these. So just take a look at that. One thing I should mention, I feel like this doesn't get mentioned a lot. So we have Zoom for doing our synchronous class sessions. The IHP has also purchased, every student has a professional Zoom account that they have access to. So that's something worth mentioning in case, for example, you want your students meeting with each other. They can do that via Zoom through the IHP, through their IHP email account. So that's paid for, and they have that. So they don't necessarily only have to use it with you. They can use it with their classmates or any other way that they want to be using it that's going to help their teaching and learning in case you want them working in groups or teams for any aspect of their coursework. Yeah. More and more people are doing recording of lectures, like Regina was asking about. And again, you could do those in Zoom, you could do them in D2L capture. Either way gets you there. I would encourage you, this is a good time to think about how you chunk those and how long those are. You know, there's always the joke that's like, why are lectures an hour? It's because there's no reason, because that was a scheduling decision, not a content or forum decision. So this is a good time if you are going to be thinking about, I want to produce a bunch of lecture content that I would have given in the class, and I want to make it as videos that students are going to watch asynchronously at their convenience through a week. What are the chunks of those, right? Instead of an hour, maybe it's 4 15-minute chunks or 3 20-minute chunks, or I don't know, 6 10-minute chunks. What are the places in the topic, in the content that it might make sense to break things up? Because the more kind of bite size it is, the easier it is for students to work through it. Especially with all that they are dealing with right now. All right. So I think that kind of segues into my next thing to think about, which is this whole challenge of synchronous versus asynchronous. And this has been a big kind of thing that we're like relitigating in online learning now that everyone's doing online, is what do you do synchronously and what do you do asynchronously? I mentioned before that I think that kind of the default, because a lot of people just did not have the time or energy to think about things or redesign their course, is we were very, very reliant on synchronous. You had your 3-hour session on a Friday, now it's a 3-hour session on Zoom on a Friday, and that's just how it is. And I will tell you that instructional designers and educational developers and teaching and learning experts, when this was all happening back in April and May, were kind of like, what is going on? This is very strange. Because historically, online teaching and learning tends to very, not exclusively, but put a lot of value and emphasis on asynchronous. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A big one is kind of the convenience and flexibility. And I think as we've discovered this spring and summer, there's big challenges to having lengthy synchronous sessions. And especially even if students can kind of get through your Zoom session, what about the Zoom session they have after that with the next course? And there's this whole thing called Zoom fatigue now, which people are writing about, which is very real in terms of it's exhausting to be in lengthy synchronous sessions. So I think it's really important to think about what type of format is going to be necessary to do what you need your students to do, because some tasks are going to be best done synchronously, and so you want to do them in that Zoom session, whatever that is, and some tasks can be done asynchronously, so why not give students the convenience and flexibility of doing them asynchronously, and it's things that they work on throughout the week in reaction to, in preparation for, in follow-up to whatever that synchronous session is going to be, depending on how you think of it as leading into the synchronous session or following out from that synchronous session. But just being really mindful of that, because I think a lot of people just defaulted to synchronous. And the big challenge is we had a lot of synchronous sessions that were not very interactive. And we're pretty good at the Institute about active learning. I think we're way above average as far as using active learning techniques and engaging with students. But it turns out when you move to Zoom, it's just technology is a barrier, and it's a barrier you have to get kind of hurdle, and that these lengthy synchronous sessions were very fatiguing for students, and it was very questionable whether we were getting the learning goals accomplished that we wanted. So one quote that I saw pretty early on in all this that I really appreciated, this was from a webinar, and there's actually a link to a recording of this in the worksheet I sent people. This teach asynchronous, coach synchronous, pithy little saying that this guy at Colorado Mesa University said. And this was actually a webinar. I thought it was pretty interesting. It was a guy who teaches stage fighting and other types of performance acting online, which, I did not think you could teach stage fighting online. I think I was wrong, is what that turns out. But the idea here of this somewhat pithy little short thing here is to really think about what are the types of things that you are going to be doing in your teaching, in your course, that are going to be highly interactive, that are going to be useful for you to do with your students, for your students to do with each other. That's where he's saying coach synchronously. So, students try something, they get feedback on it from you, from a classmate, they try it again, they improve and move forward, as opposed to, he's using a very narrow definition of teach that I don't 100% agree with, maybe 60%, maybe 40% agree with. I think his idea of teach is delivery of content. So if you think about the aspects of your course that might be a little bit more transferring of information from your head, from a textbook, from a PowerPoint slide, those are probably things that students could work through on their own, at their own pace, and then come to a synchronous session prepared to do that. One of the things, online learning is not new. It's been around for quite a long time. And one of the big strengths of online learning is that students, when it's primarily asynchronous, students really control the pace of online learning in a way that students have zero control of the classroom experience. You as the instructor control the pace of the classroom experience, and you decide this is the pace I want us to move at, and hopefully it's not too slow for some students and not too fast for the others, and hopefully it's okay for the middle. But in an online learning environment, a student can decide, I want to watch that little video twice. I want to watch that video 3 times. I want to spend a lot of time with this reading. I want to just skim this reading and move on to the next thing. In the online asynchronous world, a student has kind of more control and more responsibility for how they move through content, which was kind of one of the strengths of online teaching and learning that I think to a little bit we're perhaps not leveraging enough as we think about this new world that we are entering. All right. I have been talking at you for almost 30 minutes. I want to do kind of our main interactive thing today. In the worksheet, there's a grid, and it asks you to think about some of your plans for the fall. If you were able to bring a syllabus, syllabus does not need to be a finished syllabus. If you have a finished syllabus already, you're way ahead of me. I'm teaching this fall also. I have not looked at my syllabus yet. Don't learn from me. Bad example. But thinking about maybe your rough ideas about things that you are thinking about for the fall. And I want you to specifically, using that grid in the worksheet, there's a place where you could list, like, here's the week I was going to do it. Here's a description of the activity. I want you to think about the goal or objective of why you were doing that, and then how are you going to potentially accomplish that online. And in particular, I think the asynchronous is harder for a lot of people to wrap their head around. So I want you to think about something that, you might have done in teaching this course in the classroom, and how you're going to accomplish that as an asynchronous activity in your course. So if I could have one or two people who'd be willing to unmute themselves, you don't have to turn your camera on if you don't want to. It's totally up to you. But anyone who's willing to share some of their ideas for what they were thinking for doing this fall in terms of adapting what might have traditionally been a classroom activity into an online activity? Volunteers?
I'll volunteer.
Do it. Thank you. Go for it.
So in my auditory rehab class, one of the things I usually do in class is have students practice, one being the professional, one being a parent, and having the clinician practice educating and counseling a parent of a child newly diagnosed with hearing loss.
Mm-hmm.
So my thought is trying that in the breakout groups, so that they'd still be able to get that practice. And then all get together at the end. I'd hope to try to pop into their groups, I guess, but that would probably be hard to do. So I guess it might be discussing it at the end when they all come back.
So that's a really great example of something that's highly interactive, that needs to be done synchronously, right? It's this kind of role-playing type of activity. And so using this breakout rooms feature in Zoom. Is anyone not familiar with breakout rooms? Is that, I don't know if that's a universal knowledge thing yet or not. Anyone? People, no one is shaking their head no? Okay, so you have the ability to send people into little breakout rooms to split people up in a Zoom call. So you've got that as an option. Somebody says, I'm not familiar with breakout rooms. I feel like how do I say it longer than what I just said? So we're all in a Zoom call right now. I could decide this is an activity that would be worth doing in pairs or small groups. And if you are the person running the breakout rooms, running the Zoom call, there's a breakout rooms button, and you can send people off into those rooms so that only 2 people can have a conversation, because obviously you can't really, the one of the big downsides of Zoom is there's not a turn and talk to your neighbor, right? We'd all be talking over each other. So breakout rooms is a great way to send students off into small groups to practice various activities. You as the instructor have the ability to kind of pop from group to group. I'd say it's good. It's still, I don't know. I love being able to move around a classroom and kind of segue between groups, and it's a little bit more structured than I like, but it is the ability to say, like, okay, we've got a big group, let us send you all into groups where you're going to have a conversation. And that's a good tool to know about for any of your synchronous sessions. If you want to send students off into groups to do group work, it's very easy to kind of randomly send students into breakout rooms. You might need to, for some types of activities, do the extra work that's necessary to assign students to breakout rooms. So if you wanted students, like, I want this student and this student to always be a pair or a team or whatever over the semester, it's more clicking, but that's an option as well. And that is definitely worth knowing about for anyone who's not familiar with breakout rooms or hasn't experienced it, because at some point you're going to want to send students to breakout rooms, I think. Kathy, looked like you had your hand up.
Yeah, Tony, I just had a question. So one of the things I'm wondering about is sending students to breakout rooms and then no one is really available to give feedback during those small groups. So I'm just curious, thankfully the class I'm teaching, when we have labs now, so we would have had a 3-hour in-person lab, and that needs to be also mostly online. So I will have lab instructors to be supporting the course. How do I involve them in these breakout rooms with me at the same time? Like, we're going to have usually 7 teams that will be in these rooms. So I just worry that during this asynchronous time, are they going to feel like they're just running their own thing without any input from a lab instructor?
So, if you're doing breakout rooms with lab instructors, and this is something that our folks in PT and maybe OT, I'm not sure. PT certainly did a ton of that this summer. So you might have kind of specific students assigned to a lab instructor so that the groups are persistent across sessions. I think there is a decent amount of thinking about how often do you want them kind of going back and forth between breakout group and you doing something, right? So you might introduce a topic, explain something, send them off to their breakout groups, call them back to their breakout rooms after a certain amount of time and do a debrief, send them back into breakout rooms for the next activity. But I think there is definitely the kind of challenge that your lab instructor is kind of the person kind of facilitating those sessions. And so they need some coaching on what is my role here? What am I doing to keep students on task? So it's also one of those places where I think it can be helpful to have instructions presented written as well as presented verbally to the students, so that they have like, what are we supposed to be doing now that we've been in our breakout room for 5 minutes? Like, what's the next task in our step? In breakout rooms, you as the instructor can kind of pop from breakout room to breakout room. Students can kind of summon you if they're stuck on something, but it is challenging because you can only be in a breakout room at a time. And I'm very used to, in a classroom, I can be kind of situated where I can say, be, kind of physically proximate to multiple groups. And I can't do that in a breakout group. Breakout groups, it's black and white. You're either there or you're not. Whereas in the classroom, I can drift effortlessly. So.
Yeah, I'm almost wondering about leaving them in the small groups, like you said, like assign an LI to the group and then debrief in the small group, because debriefing with 40 people at a time isn't really working. We tried even this summer, some of the groups I had only had 8 or 9 people, and that was challenging. So I'm worried about getting that like really specific feedback, not like big global feedback, but so I think that would be
I think that would be a great thing to try and get a lab instructor to do. It might be above and beyond what a lab instructor is used to doing, but that's kind of the name of the game right now for all of us. I think that would be a great thing for a lab instructor to do, because they're going to be able to give that student much more targeted feedback. You might think about, if you're a person teaching classes that size, what is your role then? And so, for example, do you make sure that you're kind of present in a different group each activity or each week of the class or something, so that every group has a chance to get, your input, but then has a lab instructor when you're not there might be helpful.
Can a separate breakout room, can they record what happens in the breakout room and then post the recording, or look at the recording afterwards and maybe do an assignment based on like, watch how you did and do something? Okay.
They could do that. I think it's a little bit more work to do that, but it is possible.
Okay. All right. I'm going to stop now.
Cool.
and ask you 100 questions.
That's okay. I'll hang out afterwards and answer 100 questions if you have 100 questions. So anyone else want to share an example of something that they might have done in the past in the classroom that they're thinking about doing in an online way this fall? No? Okay. Let's head onward and talk about a few other things that I think are good things to be thinking about for the fall. So I could teach a whole day-long workshop on online teaching principles. I'm going to teach a 10-minute long workshop on online teaching principles inside our Pivoting to Online workshop. But this is some advice that is specific to online teaching that people have discovered for many years of teaching online. And, there's a lot of online teaching that is the same but different to classroom teaching, and some people are like, well, good teaching is good teaching regardless of where it is. But these are things that I think are particularly important in the online format. So the first one there is what we call instructor presence, and this is basically the idea of how are you, when we say present, like how do students connect with you as a human being in your online course. And in bad online courses, the instructor is basically not present or only a little bit present. And in good online courses, the instructor is kind of there and available as a person. Obviously, video components like Zoom meetings or recordings of lecture are tools that we have now that have not been around for a million years in online learning, that allow you to be kind of present in a way that only text on a screen doesn't necessarily get you. But presence can look like lots of different things. It can look like regular emails that you send to your students. It can look like meeting with a student one-on-one. It can look like news announcements that you post in D2L. It's all the places where you might give feedback when you're giving grades, as well as how you manage and run any of your synchronous sessions that you're doing via Zoom. I think, weaker online courses feel very isolating and students feel kind of like they're on this island by themselves trying to work through a textbook, and better online courses, you're the coach, you're the guide, you're there to help them out. That can look like lots of different things, and you can decide based on the number of students you have, the topic you're teaching, your comfort with various technology tools, what that's going to look like. But I think it is helpful to have a plan for like, this is where students are going to see and hear from me throughout my course, and how they're going to get to know me as an expert and hopefully relate to me as a human being. Because if they don't have that, it's very hard to stay motivated and engage in a course. So the next item here mentioned on my slide is called chunking. I mentioned this earlier with the idea of short videos, but a big deal in the online space is thinking about how do we take content, how do we take activities, and how do we make them as bite-sized as possible. So unfortunately, students, and when I say students, I mean humans, human attention spans continue to decline. Every year there's a new report that it's like now the attention span is 1 minute less than it was the year before. The trajectory for this does not look good for 10 years from now. But this is a challenging thing in the online space because the environment is potentially not as engaging as being there in a classroom. And this can be true both for synchronous sessions in Zoom and working through materials asynchronously on D2L. So I think it can be really helpful to think about how do you organize your materials into chunks, and especially if you have longer video materials like lecture content, cutting those down into pieces can make them more manageable and easier for students to navigate. Next up here, I say be explicit. So this is, again, really important in an online environment, being very clear about what do students need to do, where and when, and what's the deadline. I'll mention on the next slide, this idea of weekly overviews are a very important way to organize students, but being extremely clear about what do I need to do, where's my grade coming from, what's going on seems to matter a lot more in the online environment in terms of just knowing like what's next, what's expected of me. We sometimes teach faculty this kind of framework for assignments. It's called the Transparent Assignment Framework, and it's purpose, task, and criteria. So if you're giving students an assignment, that assignment should have, doesn't have to be labeled this way, but if I was looking at your assignment, I should be able to identify the purpose, the task, and the criteria. Most assignments are very task-oriented. Here's what you have to do. Good assignments are purpose, task, and criteria-oriented. So purpose is, why are we doing this thing? Why am I asking you to do this assignment? A lot of assignments skip this. It's implicit in like, well, I'm asking you to do it, I'm the instructor. It turns out that explaining to students why you are undertaking a given task helps all students accomplish that task more successfully because they understand the rationale for it. So it can be really useful to think about what is the purpose of this activity that you're about to do. The task, most of us are pretty good at. The task is, some kind of set of paragraphs or a bulleted list or a numbered list description of like, here's what I need you to do. Here are the steps or components of it, right? You're going to write a paper. It needs to include these sections. Here's what I want to see in it. And then that last part, we're pretty good at the IHP, but we can always be better. Criteria. How will I be evaluated? So that might look like a rubric. It might look like a description of how you're going to be graded, but where is my grade coming from? Bad assignments are just a task. Do this thing. And the purpose is invisible or kind of hidden, and the criteria is a surprise to the student when they get the grade back. Good assignments have a purpose, task, and criteria. The next one here I say is connecting the dots. So this is particularly important in an online course. I think there's a lot we do in the classroom where we orient the students to like, okay, we did this, now we're doing this, we're going to see this next week. You do a lot of that verbally and informally, and the challenge is sometimes that gets lost when you move to the online area. And that kind of connecting the dots, that connective tissue of a course is really useful for learners to understand where are we going in a course? How is what we're doing right now connect to what we did last week, to what we're going to do a month from now, to what I need to do in the clinic or in the professional setting that I'm preparing for. So being really explicit with what are we doing right now and how does it fit into the bigger picture is really valuable for students in the online world, because I think it's something, guess what, it was also useful in the classroom world. We just did it more informally. I put organization here, and then I decided organization was so big, gets its own slide. So organization really, really matters in the online space. The challenge is a lot of your students' learning is mediated through D2L and Zoom in these online spaces, and organization matters. And this is something I have been working with faculty for a very long time about. And some faculty don't like that. They're like, well, but I'm like an improvisational, teaching's like jazz, man. And then we designed their first online course and like, oh, organization really matters. As the person building a D2L course, you have a lot of control over a student's experience moving through those materials, and they need to be organized. It needs to be very clear to a student, what do I need to do next? Where do I find the next thing I need to accomplish to move forward in this course? If it's not, they feel confused, they feel frustrated, they disengage from the course, they want to do the assignment, but they're stumped and need to ask you for help or a classmate for help, and they are then waiting to hear back from someone, and it's not good. You want your courses to be clean and well organized. That's something Joyce and I are always happy to give people feedback on. I'll be honest, I will be honest with you about how your course can be better organized. Some people say, here, tell me my course is organized. And I was like, well, could be better. So some of the things to keep things well organized, a weekly structure is a good default. Not some courses, it's not weekly, it might be some other unit of time, but some chronological structure is really good. Being consistent with how materials are presented, what they look like, how they're labeled. You know, if you've got something that's called an assignment over here in D2L and you call it a homework in the syllabus and you're always referring to it as a project in Zoom sessions, well, you've given 3 names to the same thing and students are going to be confused. That's not good. Organizer pages, there's a screenshot of an organizer page on the right side of your screen there. So important that we're doing a short 30-minute session just on organizer pages and why you need them. So organizer pages are an introduction each week, tell students what's going on in the week. They're very, very useful to help students navigate the online space. And then just making sure you think about student-centered labeling and organizing. I see a lot of early drafts of online courses that are very instructor-oriented. They might be organized in terms of buckets of like, here's my PowerPoint, here's the readings, here's some additional materials. And that was kind of instructor-oriented in terms of like, well, here's the thing I made, here's the things I had to find, and here's some other stuff I'm going to send them to. But so that structure is very faculty oriented and it's not necessarily student oriented. A student oriented view might be arranging those material in the sequence you expect students to work through them, thinking about them as topics, not thinking of them as like, well, I made this versus I had to find this. This is a video versus this is a PowerPoint. Those are meaningful to you as the person creating an online experience. They are not meaningful to the student working their way through the online learning environment. And again, that's a place that Joyce and I could help you with one-on-one if you need it. Joyce?
Also, Tony, Regina just put in the chat that she has a student, Christine, who is actually helping her, Jean, who's helping her with the design. So students are also good for feedback when you get a design going as well. So just throwing that in.
Yeah. Students can give you good feedback. It's important to know students or colleagues. I know, again, this is challenging for the fall because you did not have a lot of lead time. For people who had, they were teaching a full-blown online course and they had, 3 months to develop it. I know a lot of people who will like basically trade courses with someone a week before things happen and they like write up each other, here's all the things that are confusing and feedback. It's important to know when you're testing stuff, students will be able to, or anyone testing your materials as an outside reader, they may be able to identify like, this is confusing, or I don't understand why this is this. They may not be able to tell you how it should be, right? But they may be able to identify places where it needs work.
Yeah, interestingly, the students just joined our faculty meeting, and one of the things that they said around this particular topic was having the weekly module say, this is what you need to do before the class, this is what we will do during the class, and this is what you need to follow up on after the class. Really, really help them structure.
Make it easy. Yeah.
Their learning in the course. Yeah.
This stuff about making it easy, it's all about what is work that you as one person can do that makes things hopefully easier for a lot of people. And it's challenging, there might be mistakes that we make or organizations we meet, and then they ripple and they're, you've frustrated or confused 20 or 40 people, and that's not great. And you're burning a lot of their time. And I think it's especially important now because it is a very hard time to be a student right now. It's a hard time for you to be a faculty member. It's also a very hard time to be a student. And just the more you can be on top of this is kind of making things easier. I mentioned here some of the things that we're hearing, that students need in this, the world that they are trying to be a student in. And these are things I think we have been very good at providing at the Institute in the classroom, in our physical spaces, support, community, collaboration, flexibility. I bold that one. Like, I think we have these very much figured out in physical world, and now we are figuring out these things in the online world, and that's hard. We know that these are important, and there are some ways we know how to do them, but these are not things we are expert at providing online that, I think we need, because we need to get better at, because students need this right now because their lives are very stressful and confusing, because everybody's lives are some degree of stressful and confusing right now.
Tony, I have a question.
Go
I
for it.
can say it now or wait.
Go for it.
It had to do with something you said earlier, as well as what we just talked about with the organization. So earlier you had talked about how thinking about things with asynchronous learning could be things that a student could read on their own and do on their own, whereas synchronous should be more that coaching time. I'm curious what you have to say from talking to others as well as others in this group. I always struggle with, there's always seems to be a group of students who don't do the learning outside. So then it causes problems when you're in the group because some people know what to be doing, others don't know what to be doing. So then I end up teaching in the class to make sure everyone's on the same page. How do you suggest managing that?
And this is, you've identified here a challenge that was probably everyone's going to face a version of that this fall, but it is not unique to online, right? We have this challenge in the classroom as well. I think it's worth thinking about, there's two aspects of it. How do we ask students to prepare for class? And how do we make sure that we're being kind of as explicit as possible about this is what you need to do? I think about this in terms of reading questions and reading guides. So not just read this textbook chapter, but read this textbook chapter and here's what I want you to get out of it. Here's the questions you should be able to answer. Here's the terms you should be able to define. Here's the things I want you to take notes on. That level of explicit of what preparation looks like. And then the next, so step one being kind of over communicating what I need you to do. And then step two, how do we hold people accountable for that, right? That might be a quiz that they do before class or at the start of class. It might be some kind of assessment where we, ask you to show that you are doing the things you're doing. And it's hard because there exists a lot of varieties of that, from the person who just doesn't open the textbook to the person that spends time looking at a textbook or other materials, but isn't getting what we need out of it. And so they put time in, but aren't showing up prepared in the way we want them to. And it's then challenging because if you then default into like, well, I'll teach you the thing that you should have, that you should have prepared. I mean, I think students pick up on that pretty quickly in terms of you are sending them a message about what they do and don't need to do to prepare. Because if I was a student who prepared and then I show up and it's all being covered again, how many times in a row am I going to prepare before I figure out that it's going to get covered in class? And, I think some students make these choices about, this is a class where I need to learn from the textbook, and this is a class where I'm going to learn from the lecture. And really what we need is classes where you do both, right? But I think a lot of students figure out from the format, where is it going to happen? So I would say, again, two things: being really clear about what the expectations are and how you want them to be prepared. And then if you're not getting the results you want in the past, thinking about how you are going to kind of assess that and assign a grade to that, which probably looks like a quiz or something they're turning in. So
thank you.
Yeah. Let me jump through a few more things and then I'll open it up to questions. So other things for online, again, I said it before, this is a hard time to be a student. It's really important to think about how are you going to check in with your students, especially because I think this is a kind of thing that you might have done informally in the classroom, and now you have to think about what does that look like online, which might be a little bit more awkward. So that could be talking to people in Zoom. It could be sending out a periodic survey to your students. There's an example of a check-in survey that somebody used with undergraduate students at the start of the pandemic that I thought was useful for inspiration in the worksheet. But how are you going to know that they're doing okay and kind of check in on people? Because it's a little bit harder to do that even through Zoom, through D2L, than it was in the classroom. You don't have the same access to those kind of nonverbals and body languages and things like that. Also, you got to check in with yourself. You are all doing this new thing that, you maybe didn't want to be doing, didn't sign up to be doing. You're teaching an online course, and we're not necessarily given all of the time that you needed to prep for that. So make sure you give yourself time and self-care to make that happen. And the last thing I wanted to kind of put here, this is a quote from Kevin Gannon, who's a faculty developer at Grandview University. And this is not about online, but I think it's really good to remember in this world of online. Good pedagogy requires regular, effective, and compassionate communication with students. Again, I think we've been very good at the ISP about doing that in the classroom, and we just got to make sure that we're going to do that online as well. Flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. Again, things are really stressful right now, and it's like, I think we need to be as flexible as our resources allow us to be with students. Students are in all kinds of weird housing situations and caregiving situations, and their lives are all turned upside down. And there may be things that are going on in their lives that are very complicated, that are frankly more important than what we're doing in our class. And we have to be as flexible as we can to help them out to the degree we can, right? I mean, you can't be more flexible than you can, and that's how flexible we need to be. And then last one here, transparency in course material, like test assignments and activities. You got to be as clear as possible about what's due when, what's covered by what are the expectations. This is a great time to think about in your teaching. Where is there uncertainty? Where am I causing confusion or frustration for my students? And how can I make sure that doesn't happen this time around, to make it my course, a meaningful teaching and learning activity and not a place of stress or anxiety or frustration for students. Yeah. So I'm going to hang around for a little while and take questions from people, but I thought this would be a good time to wrap things up, and I am going to stop the recording of this, so you're off the record.